stop acting like you're his dad. You have no right to tell me where I go or who I stay with. My nephew Tyler yelled right in front of his friends, in the middle of my own living room. I had simply asked him where he was spending the night, since it was almost 11 p.m. on a Monday and he had school the next day. A normal question from any responsible adult with an 18-year-old. His friends' laughter echoed through the house. One of them even whispered, "Dude, you destroyed his uncle," while Tyler smiled with that arrogance I knew so well. I stood at the entrance to the living room, holding the mug of coffee I had made to work late, and felt something strange happening inside my chest. It wasn't anger. It was a cold, crystal-clear calm. My name is Carlos, and at 35, I never imagined I would be raising my nephew after my brother and sister-in-law died in a car accident 2 years ago. Tyler was 16 at the time, a boy devastated by loss, and I opened my home and my heart to him without hesitation. Now, looking at this young man who had become his own arrogant stranger in my living room, I understood that my kindness had been interpreted as weakness. And Tyler was about to discover the difference between the two. I work as a software engineer, own a house in a decent neighborhood in Austin, Texas, and have always been the type of guy who avoids conflict. When Tyler arrived, traumatized and lost, I did everything I could to make him feel at home. I paid for private therapy, moved my office to the basement so he could have a bigger bedroom, and even tolerated the loud parties he threw when I was away on business. But in the last 6 months, since he turned 18, Tyler had changed. The gratitude disappeared, replaced by an attitude of entitlement that baffled me. He contributed nothing to the household, ate my food, used my car, and still had the audacity to treat me like an intruder in my own life. "Relax, Tyler," one of his friends said. "Your uncle was just asking." "No, man," Tyler replied loudly enough for me to hear perfectly. "He needs to understand that he's not my dad. I live here, but that doesn't mean he has any power over me. I'm an adult." The other boys laughed again, and Tyler continued, "I appreciate him letting me stay here after my parents died, but now it's different. I don't have to follow anyone's rules." At that moment, something clicked in my mind. Tyler had just given me the answer to a problem I didn't even know I was trying to solve. He was right about one thing: he was an adult. And if he wasn't my son, and I had no authority over him, then our relationship was purely optional. I smiled at them and nodded. "You're right, Tyler. Totally right. My bad." My voice came out calm and friendly, which clearly surprised everyone in the room. Tyler blinked a few times, obviously expecting an argument or at least some resistance. Okay. Cool. "Have fun, guys," I said, heading back to the kitchen with my still hot coffee. What Tyler didn't know was that, in those few minutes, I had begun to completely rethink our living situation. If he wanted to be treated like an independent adult who happened to live in my house, then that was exactly what he would get. And over the next 72 hours, Tyler would discover that there are consequences for every choice we make in adult life. If you're enjoying this story of transformation and boundaries, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see how ingratitude can backfire on those who practice it. Because what happened next was a lesson that his mind would never forget. The next morning, I woke up at 6 a.m. as usual, made my coffee, and went down to the basement where my office was now. Tyler and his friends had stayed up until 3 in the morning watching movies on my 75-inch television, leaving the living room looking like a war zone. Empty beer cans covered the coffee table I had bought the year before. Pizza crusts were stuck to the leather sofa that had taken me 2 years to save up for. The smell of marijuana still lingered in the air, even though I had made it clear from day one that I did not allow drugs in the house. When Tyler finally came downstairs at 11 in the morning, wearing only his underwear and an old t-shirt, he showed no embarrassment at the state of the living room. He walked right past me into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and grabbed the orange juice I had bought the day before. "Hey, Uncle," he said, drinking straight from the carton, "can you lend me $50? I'm going out with a girl tonight." This was another trait Tyler had recently developed, the ease with which he asked for money. Never please, never when can you pay me back. It was always presented as if it were my duty to finance his social life. "Sure," I replied, taking out my wallet. "Here's $50. Tyler took the money without even looking at me, focused entirely on his phone. "Thanks. Oh, and I probably won't be coming home tonight. I'm staying at her place." "That's fine," I said. "Have fun." What Tyler didn't know was that while he slept late, I had spent the early hours of the morning researching tenant rights in the state of Texas. I discovered some fascinating things. For example, even if someone has lived in a house for 2 years, if he doesn't pay rent and doesn't have a formal lease, he technically has no tenant rights. They are considered a guest, who can be asked to leave with 30 days' notice. Another interesting fact, a landlord has the complete right to change the living conditions of a guest at any time, including access to utilities, common areas, and household privileges. I spent the rest of the morning watching Tyler. Really watching, as if he were a stranger I was meeting for the first time. He ate my cereal straight from the box while watching Netflix on his premium account. He used his expensive shampoo in a shower that lasted 40 minutes, using up all the hot water. He took his car keys without asking and left to pick up more friends. When he came back with 3 guys I'd never seen before, they settled into my backyard, using my grill, drinking my beer, and making so much noise that my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, came over to complain. "Tyler," I called through the back door, "can you turn it down a little?" He looked at me with that expression that had become so familiar, a mixture of irritation and condescension, as if I were a child interrupting an adult conversation. "Dude, relax," he said loudly enough for all his friends to hear. "It's just music. The neighbor should get used to it." One of his friends laughed and added, "Yeah, Uncle Carlos, don't be a stickler." At that moment, something crystallized in my mind. This wasn't just casual disrespect from a rebellious teenager. It was a systematic pattern of behavior that he had developed since he turned 18. He had come to the conclusion that because I had taken him in at a time of tragedy, he now had permanent rights to my home, my food, his money, and his respect. Even more disturbing, he genuinely believed that I owed these things to her. I went back inside and started taking notes. Not because I was planning anything specific yet, but because my engineer's mind always documented patterns. And Tyler was exhibiting very clear patterns. Pattern number 1, he never thanked me for anything. Housing, food, clothes, allowance, car, everything was accepted as a basic entitlement, not a favor or generosity. Pattern number 2, he consistently disrespected my boundaries. Schedules, house rules, simple requests for cleanliness or courtesy, all ignored or contested. Pattern number 3, he showed zero interest in contributing to the household or family. He didn't clean, cook, help with bills or maintenance. His presence was purely parasitic. Pattern number 4, and perhaps the most revealing, he became genuinely angry when I showed any expectation of reciprocity or respect. At 6 o'clock in the evening, as Tyler was getting ready to go out with a mysterious little girl using my $50, he stopped in the kitchen where I was preparing dinner for one. "Uncle," he said, adjusting the shirt I had bought her the month before, "you need to relax a little more. Like, I know you've been worried about me since my parents died, but you don't have to watch me all the time." "I wasn't watching you," I replied calmly, stirring the pasta sauce. "I don't know, man. Sometimes it feels like you want to control everything I do. I'm not a kid anymore, you know? I can make my own decisions." I looked at Tyler, really looked at him, and tried to find some trace of the 16-year-old boy who had arrived at my door 2 years earlier, devastated by the loss of his parents, asking only for a safe place to process her grief. That boy was completely gone. In his place was a young adult who saw kindness as weakness, generosity as obligation, and gratitude as an outdated concept. "You're right," I said finally. "You can make your own decisions." Tyler smiled, interpreting my agreement as surrender. "Exactly. I'm glad you finally understand that." After he left, leaving the front door open and the yard lights on, I sat down at the kitchen table with his dinner and a stack of legal documents I had printed out during the day. What Tyler didn't understand was that by declaring his independence so categorically, he had inadvertently freed her as well. If he wasn't my son, and I had no authority over her, then our relationship was voluntary on both sides. And voluntary relationships can be ended by either party, at any time, for any reason. Tyler would soon discover that independence comes with responsibilities. And responsibilities have consequences. Because over the next 48 hours, I would implement a series of changes that would completely transform her understanding of what it meant to be an independent adult living in the home of another independent adult. Tyler didn't come home that night. Or the next. In fact, it was 5 full days with no word, no messages, no basic consideration for someone who might be worried about his whereabouts. On the 5th day, he simply showed up in the kitchen at 2 in the afternoon, looking hungover and wearing the same clothes he had worn the week before. There were no apologies, no explanations, Not even a greeting. He opened my refrigerator, took the last eggs I had bought for my breakfast, and started cooking them as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Tyler," I said calmly, looking up from my laptop, "where have you been for the last 5 days?" He looked at me as if I had asked the most ridiculous question possible. "At Megan's house. I told you I was staying there. You said you were staying 1 night. It's been 5. "So what?" he replied, stirring the eggs in the pan with sharp, angry movements. "I don't have to explain my schedule to anyone." I watched him for a moment. The casual arrogance in his voice, the way he treated my genuine concern as if it were an unacceptable intrusion into her adult life. It was fascinating in a disturbing way. "Sure," I said finally. "You're right." Tyler seemed surprised by my lack of resistance, but quickly turned his attention back to breakfast. My breakfast, prepared with her food in her kitchen, while he was probably planning to use her shower and her washing machine before leaving again. It was that afternoon that things really deteriorated. I was in an important video conference with a potential client when I heard the first loud bang coming from upstairs. I ignored it, trying to maintain my professionalism as I presented design proposals. Then came another bang. And another. "Excuse me," I said to the client. "There's some construction in the neighborhood. Can I mute you for a moment?" I ran upstairs to investigate and found Tyler and 3 friends that her and I had never seen before completely rearranging my guest room. They had moved all the furniture, piling it against one wall, and were now setting up what looked like a makeshift recording studio. "Tyler," I called from the doorway, "what's going on here?" "Oh, hi, Uncle," he said without even looking at me, focused on connecting cables to expensive equipment that definitely wasn't his. "The guys and I are starting a podcast. We needed a place to record." "In his guest room?" "It's the only place with good acoustics," said one of his friends, a skinny kid with tattoos covering his arms. "Tyler said you wouldn't mind." I looked around the room. He had removed all my decorations from the walls, pushed his old desk against the window, and was in the process of installing acoustic foam panels with double-sided tape, which would definitely damage the paint when removed. "I'm in an important work meeting," I said, keeping my voice low and controlled. "Can you guys do this later?" Tyler finally looked at me, and I saw something in her expression that made me genuinely alarmed. It wasn't apology or embarrassment. It was pure irritation, as if I were a child interrupting an important adult project. "Dude, relax," he said, turning his attention back to the cables. "We'll try to be quieter. But we can't stop now, we've rented all this equipment for today." "Rented with what money?" The question came out before I could stop myself. Tyler paused. The other guys stopped working and looked between us. "With my money," Tyler replied slowly, her voice carrying a note of defiance I'd never heard before. "What money?" "The money you gave me last week. And what's left of my allowance." Allowance. He had called it allowance. As if it were something I owed him, not something I chose to give him out of generosity. "Tyler, that $50 was for your date with the girl." "And I used it for something more important," he replied, now clearly annoyed. "Look, Uncle, I appreciate everything you've done for me, but you can't expect to control how I spend my money." My money. He had just called her money his money. At that moment, something changed permanently in me. It wasn't anger. It was a cold, crystal-clear clarity, like when his problem finally becomes clear after months of frustration. "You have until 6 o'clock this evening to clean this room," I said calmly. "Come on, man," said the tattooed kid. "We can't take all this down now. We have 2 hours of recording scheduled." "Tyler," I said, completely ignoring his friend, "at 6 o'clock this evening, this room is going back to the way it was." Tyler stared at me for a long moment. Then, to my complete shock, he laughed. A loud, disrespectful laugh. "Or what?" he asked. "Are you going to punish me? Send me to my room." He looked at his friends, who started laughing too. "Guys, my uncle thinks he can boss me around like I'm a kid." It was at that moment that I knew with absolute certainty that Tyler had crossed a line from which there would be no return. This wasn't just casual teenage disrespect. It was a deliberate declaration of war against his authority, his generosity, and his very person. "I understand," I said simply, and went back downstairs. My meeting had ended automatically when the time limit was reached. I would have to call back and apologize, probably losing an important client because of the interruption. Yet another consequence of Tyler's decision to treat my house as her personal property. I sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop and began researching something specific: Texas housing laws for adult non-paying occupants. The noise from upstairs continued until almost midnight. Recording, loud laughter, music playing. At one point, I clearly heard Tyler yelling to his friends, "Don't worry about the noise, it's my house too." My house too. By 2 in the morning, when it finally quieted down, I had compiled a complete dossier on his rights as a landlord and the legal obligations of uninvited occupants. What I discovered was enlightening. Tyler had spent 2 years living under the emotional and legal protection of being a traumatized minor in his care. But at 18, that protection had completely expired. He was now, in legal terms, an adult trespasser whom I tolerated out of kindness. And kindness, I discovered, could be withdrawn at any time. The next morning, Tyler came downstairs at 11 wearing only shorts, grabbed his orange juice from the fridge, and started drinking straight from the bottle while checking his phone. "Tyler," I said, "we need to talk." "About what?" he asked without looking up. "About her expectations for living here." Now he looked at me with that expression that had become so familiar, irritation mixed with condescension. "Uncle, we've already discussed this. I'm an adult. I don't have to follow childish rules." "You're right," I said calmly. "You're an adult. A completely independent adult." He smiled, thinking he had one again. "Exactly. Great. So, as an independent adult living in the home of another independent adult, you can start paying rent." The smile disappeared instantly. "What?" "Rent. $500 a month. Plus half the electricity, water, and internet bills. Food's on her." Tyler stared at me as if I had just suggested he fly to the moon. "You're joking." "I'm not. You want to be treated like an independent adult. Adults pay for where they live." "But I'm his nephew. And I'm his uncle who offered you a free place to live for 2 years. Now you're an adult who doesn't want supervision or rules." "Perfect. Let's make this a purely business arrangement." Tyler put the juice down on the counter hard enough to make it splash. "This is ridiculous. I don't have $500 a month." "Then I suggest you get a job." "A job," he repeated, as if it were the most offensive word in the English language. "Yes, Tyler. A job. That's how independent adults pay for housing, food, and the things they want." He stood there for a long moment, processing this new reality. Then, to my complete surprise, he laughed again. But this time, the laugh had a cruel edge to it. "Uncle, you're being dramatic. You're not going to charge me rent. I'm family." And he walked out of the kitchen as if the conversation was over. It was at that moment that I fully understood what I was dealing with. Tyler genuinely believed that our family relationship gave him permanent rights to my generosity, with no reciprocal obligation of respect or gratitude. He had confused compassionate grief with permanent weakness. It was time to educate him on the difference. That afternoon, I called my lawyer. Not to threaten Tyler or take drastic measures, but to understand exactly where I stood legally and what options I had as a property owner. What I learned surprised me. I had a lot more power than I realized. And Tyler was about to discover that treating generosity as a given is one of the quickest ways to lose it completely. Because if he wanted to be an independent adult with no rules or supervision, I was more than willing to treat him exactly that way. From that day forward, our relationship would change completely. And Tyler would discover that independence comes with responsibilities he had never considered. The conversation with my lawyer, Brian Henderson, was enlightening in a way I never imagined. Her voice on the phone carried that mix of professionalism and genuine fun that experienced lawyers display when they encounter a particularly interesting case. "Carlos, technically, Tyler has no legal right to live on your property," he explained as I took detailed notes. "He doesn't pay rent, he doesn't have a lease, and as an adult, he's not under her legal guardianship. Legally speaking, he's a guest who can be asked to leave with 30 days written notice. What if she refuses? Then it becomes trespassing. You can involve the police." But I didn't want to involve the police. Not yet. I wanted Tyler to learn about consequences in a more educational way. Over the next 3 days, I watched Tyler with new eyes. It was like studying a fascinating specimen in his natural habitat. He woke up late, ate my food, used his utilities, and treated my house like a five-star hotel where room service was guaranteed and free. On Tuesday, I found a mountain of his dirty clothes piled in front of the washing machine. Not inside the machine, in front of her, as if it were my responsibility to process them. When I casually mentioned that the laundry was available, Tyler replied, "Oh, you can wash it when you have time. No rush. Wash it." As if it were a task that naturally fell to me. On Wednesday, I came home from a meeting to find Tyler and two friends in my kitchen preparing an elaborate dinner with expensive ingredients I had bought for the week. They were using every pot, pan, and utensil that he owned, turning the place into a culinary war zone. "Hi, Uncle," Tyler said without looking up from the frying pan where he was cooking a steak that had cost $25 a pound. "We made dinner for everyone. There's some left for him in the fridge. Some left. For me. From the food I had bought. In my own home." It was at that moment that the last piece of my plan fell perfectly into place. On Thursday morning, Tyler came down for breakfast and found a sealed envelope in his usual spot on the kitchen table. Inside was an official document printed on letterhead from my lawyer's office. "Formal notice of termination of lodging," the header read. Tyler read the document twice, her expression gradually changing from confusion to disbelief, and finally to anger. "This is ridiculous," he said, throwing the paper on the table. "You can't evict me. I'm his nephew." "I'm not evicting you," I replied calmly, stirring my coffee. "I'm formalizing our new relationship as independent adults. The document gives you 30 days to decide whether you want to remain a paying tenant or make other living arrangements." "Paying tenant?" Tyler laughed, but the sound came out forced and humorless. "Uncle, come on. You're not going to charge your own brother's son rent." My brother's son was a traumatized minor who needed care and protection. You are an 18-year-old man who has declared his complete independence from her supervision or authority. These are completely different situations. Tyler stood still for a long moment, processing this new reality. Then, as I expected, he tried the emotional tactic. "My parents just died 2 years ago. You're going to throw him out on the street." "His parents died 2 years ago," I corrected gently. "He's had 2 years of free mourning, free housing, free food, paid therapy, supported education, and unconditional care. Now you're an adult who wants to be treated like one." "But—" "Tyler," I interrupted, "you were very clear about not wanting supervision, rules, or any form of guidance from me." "You're right. You're an adult. Adults pay for where they live, buy her own food, and take responsibility for her choices. I'm simply honoring your request for complete independence." He opened and closed his mouth several times, like a fish out of water. Finally, he found his voice. "I don't have money for rent." "Then I suggest you find a job. Or consider other housing options." "What other options?" "I have nowhere to go." And there it was. The raw truth that he had avoided facing for months. Her declaration of independence was purely performative. In reality, he was completely dependent on my continued generosity, but he had assumed that generosity was permanent and unconditional. "I'm sure you'll figure something out," I said. "You're smart, capable, and now completely independent." Tyler stormed out of the kitchen stomping his feet like a 5-year-old, which destroyed any remaining illusions about her emotional maturity. For the rest of the week, I watched Tyler struggle with his new reality. He tried a few different strategies to reverse the situation. First came the emotional manipulation. Tears about his parents, about how abandoned he felt, about how I was the only family he had left. I remained compassionate but firm. He would always be my nephew, but our living arrangement now had clear terms. Then came the anger. Shouts about ingratitude, about how he helped me around the house, about how family should support family unconditionally. I calmly pointed out that I couldn't think of any significant help he had provided in recent months, and that family support works both ways. Finally, the attempt at negotiation came. Tyler offered to do some housework in exchange for free housing. I explained that basic housework was the minimum expectation of any resident, not a bargaining chip for housing. It was over the weekend that Tyler really started to panic. He had clearly researched rent prices in our area and discovered that $500 a month was incredibly cheap. Basic studio apartments cost at least $800, and that didn't include utilities. If you're following this journey of growth and consequences, subscribe to the channel to see how healthy boundaries can transform toxic relationships. On Sunday night, Tyler made his last attempt. He approached me while I was watching television, her posture noticeably more submissive than it had been in months. "Uncle," he said, sitting on the edge of the couch, "maybe we could work something out." "What kind of deal?" "Like, maybe I could pay a little less at first, until I find a job? And maybe she could relax a little about some of the rules." "What rules?" Tyler gestured vaguely. "Like curfew, who he can bring over, where he can go, kid stuff." There it was again. Tyler still didn't understand that these weren't kid rules, they were basic expectations of respect between adults sharing a space. He wanted all the benefits of independent adult life without any of the responsibilities. "The expectations are simple," I said. "If you choose to stay as a tenant, you will pay $500 on the first day of every month, plus half of the utilities. He will buy his own food. He will keep common areas clean. He will treat the property with respect. And he will follow local laws regarding noise and disturbance." "What if I can't pay on the first month?" "Then you'll have 29 days left to make other arrangements." Tyler was silent for a long time, clearly doing mental calculations that didn't add up favorably. "That's cruel," he said finally. "No, Tyler. Cruel would be to let you continue believing that adult behavior has no adult consequences. Cruel would be to allow you to enter the real world completely unprepared for the basic expectations of reciprocity and responsibility." That night, while Tyler presumably considered his limited options, I sat in his basement office and reviewed the documents Brian had prepared. Everything was perfectly legal, perfectly reasonable, and perfectly inevitable. Tyler had spent 2 years confusing compassionate grief with permanent weakness. He interpreted my generosity as obligation, her patience as submission, and her kindness as his birthright. But kindness is not weakness. And generosity is not obligation. It was time for Tyler to learn the difference between the two. And in the next few days, he would discover that getting what you ask for isn't always what you really want. Because Tyler had asked to be treated like an independent adult. And I was about to grant his wish more completely than he ever imagined possible. Starting tomorrow, her real education about adult life would finally begin. The following Monday, he woke up at 7 in the morning. Not because he wanted to, but because the house fire alarm went off at 6:58. He ran down the stairs in his pajamas, finding me calmly drinking coffee in the kitchen while the deafening sound echoed through the house. "Uncle, what the hell is going on?" he yelled over the alarm. "Monthly safety test," I replied calmly, turning off the alarm with the remote control. "Sorry, I forgot to tell you." Tyler looked at me with an expression of pure disbelief. "At 7 in the morning on a Monday?" "Best time. It ensures that all occupants of the house are aware of emergency procedures." That's when Tyler noticed the stack of papers on the table next to me. Official forms, all with his name clearly visible at the top. "What are those?" "Cohabitation documentation," I said, pushing a pen toward her. "I need you to sign these today. Legal protocol for adult tenants." Tyler picked up the first document and began to read. Her eyebrows furrowed more with each line. "Monthly room inspection? Professional cleaning fee? $500 security deposit." "Standard for any residential property," I replied. "You said you wanted to be treated like an independent adult. Adults follow formal housing protocols." "But Uncle." "Carlos," I corrected gently. "If we're going to have a formal business relationship, I prefer you use his name." The look on Tyler's face was fascinating to watch. It was like watching someone trying to solve a complex puzzle and gradually realizing that essential pieces were missing. That's ridiculous," he said finally, throwing the papers back on the table. "Ridiculous how?" I asked, picking up his laptop. "Let me show you some apartment listings in our area." I opened several tabs in my browser, all with local rental listings. Studio apartment, $800 a month, no utilities. 1-bedroom apartment, $1,200, $200 application fee, first and last month's rent due in advance. Tyler stared at the screens, her expression growing paler by the second. "See how $500 is actually pretty generous." Just then, his phone rang. It was Megan, the girl he had spent 5 days with the previous week. "Hey, little girl," Tyler answered, trying to regain his usual confidence. Even from the kitchen, I could hear her voice through the speaker. She didn't sound happy. "Tyler, you can't stay here anymore. My parents found out you were sleeping in my room and they're furious. They said if they find him here again, they'll call the police." Tyler's confidence vanished instantly. But Megan, I thought. It was fun, but I can't risk my situation here. "I'm sorry." She hung up. Tyler held the phone for a long moment, processing this new reality. Her social safety net had just disappeared. Problem with alternative accommodations? I asked innocently. He didn't answer, busy frantically typing messages to other contacts. After 10 minutes of tense silence, he looked up at me. "No one can host me permanently." Understandable. People his age don't usually have the resources to support extra dependents. "I'm not a dependent." "Tyler, you don't have a job, you don't have savings, and for the past 2 years, all your basic needs have been provided by someone else. Objectively speaking, that is literally the definition of dependent." He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. For the first time since he turned 18, Tyler was being forced to confront basic realities about his financial situation. "I can get a job," he said finally. "Excellent. There are several local establishments hiring. McDonald's is paying $12 an hour. Walmart offers $13 for sales associates. Assuming 40 hours a week, that would be about $2,000 gross per month." Tyler did the math in his head, her expression growing increasingly grim. "After taxes, that's about $1,600 net," I continued. "$500 for rent here, plus another $250 for her share of utilities, would leave you about $850 for food, transportation, clothing, and other necessities." That's possible," Tyler said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Absolutely. Many young adults live on similar budgets. Of course, that means no expensive outings, no new electronic gadgets, no designer clothes. Basic, functional living." Tyler was silent for several minutes, clearly doing more detailed calculations in her head. "What if I can't pay the first month, his? Then you'll have 28 days left to find alternative arrangements." "Like what?" "I don't know, Tyler. You're an independent adult. Adults solve his own housing problems." It was at that moment that Tyler finally understood the full extent of his situation. He had no backup plan. He had no safety net. He had no resources other than the generosity he had systematically abused for months. "Uncle Carlos," he corrected himself quickly, "maybe we could make a different arrangement." "What kind of deal?" "Like, maybe I could do chores around the house instead of paying rent?" "Tyler, basic housework is the minimum expectation of any resident. Cleaning, simple maintenance, consideration for others, that's not a bargaining chip. It's basic adult behavior." He stood there, clearly panicking for the first time since I'd known him. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, and for the first time in months, I heard genuine vulnerability in her voice. "I want you to make an adult decision. You can accept the terms of tenancy, $500 a month, half the utilities, respect for the basic house rules, or you can find other accommodations. But you need to decide today." "Today?" "Tyler, you've had a week to consider your options. A week to look for jobs, alternative apartments, or do any kind of adult planning. Instead, you spent the week hoping I would change my mind." The truth of that statement was undeniable. Tyler had genuinely believed that her would back down, that her threat was just theater to scare him. I need to think." "Sure. You have until 6 o'clock this evening. After that, if there's no clear decision, I'll assume he's chosen to make other arrangements, and I'll help her pack her things." Tyler left the kitchen like a zombie, finally confronting the reality he had avoided for 2 years. Actions have consequences, and generosity is not a given. At 3 in the afternoon, he returned to the kitchen where I was working. "I accept," he said quietly. "Accept what?" "The terms. $500 a month. Half the utilities. And—" Tyler swallowed hard. "And respect the house rules." "Which rules specifically?" It was painful to watch Tyler struggle to articulate basic concepts of community living that he should have learned years ago. Like, clean up after I use something? Don't make excessive noise? Let you know when I'm going out. That's a good start. And the payment? The first month is due tomorrow. Panic returned to Tyler's eyes. Tomorrow? But I don't have. Then I suggest you start looking for a job today. Many places hire immediately for entry-level positions. Tyler nodded miserably and left the house for the first time in weeks with a real purpose: economic survival. What he didn't know was that I had spent the morning making some strategic phone calls. To local establishments where I knew the managers. To people who could offer honest work to a young man willing to learn humility through hard work. Tyler had spent 2 years learning that terrible behavior had no real consequences. Now he would discover that responsible adult behavior had genuine rewards. But first, he would have to get through the hardest part, recognizing that he had confused kindness with weakness, and generosity with obligation. And while he knocked on doors looking for his first real job, I prepared for the final phase of her education in adulthood. Because Tyler was about to discover that growing up isn't about age, it's about accepting responsibility for your choices. 6 months later, Tyler was unrecognizable. Not physically, though he had lost weight working 8 hours a day at the local McDonald's, and then landing a second part-time job at a hardware store. It was something deeper. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet determination I hadn't seen in him since he was a child. On the morning of his first day off in 3 weeks, I found him in the kitchen at 6 a.m., making coffee for both of us. "Good morning, Carlos," he said, handing me a steaming mug. "I thought you might like some coffee before you start work." I took the mug, watching the young man in front of me. This Tyler had learned that small gestures of consideration weren't signs of weakness, but building blocks of healthy relationships. "Thanks, Tyler. How was your night?" "Good. I managed to save another $200 this month." He paused, stirring his own coffee. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about that." Over the past few months, Tyler had become a meticulous financial planner. Every dollar he earned was carefully budgeted between rent, utilities, food, and a small savings account he was obsessively building. "I got a promotion at the hardware store," he continued. "The manager said he's never seen anyone learn so quickly about tools and building materials. It'll be $15 an hour, plus commission." "That's fantastic, Tyler. You deserve it." And he really did. I had watched his transformation with growing fascination and pride. The young man who used to sleep until noon now woke up at 5 in the morning voluntarily. The little girl who had never cleaned a plate now kept the common area spotless without being asked. Even more impressive, Tyler had developed a work ethic that surprised his bosses. He arrived early, stayed late when necessary, and treated every customer with genuine respect. "Carlos," Tyler said, her voice carrying a seriousness I had rarely heard before, "I wanted to apologize." "For what?" "For everything. For how I treated you. For taking it for granted that you would always be there, no matter how terrible I was." He paused, choosing his words carefully. I didn't realize that generosity isn't an obligation. I sat down at the table, gesturing for him to do the same. "Tyler, you don't need to apologize. You were dealing with huge trauma at a very difficult age." "No," he interrupted firmly. "That's an excuse, not a reason. Losing my parents was horrible, but that didn't give me the right to treat her like trash." This was another fascinating change. Tyler had developed the ability to accept full responsibility for his actions without hiding behind circumstances. "Remember that night when I said you had no right to know where I was going?" he continued. "I was wrong. Completely wrong. You weren't some stranger controlling him. You were family who genuinely cared about him. You were trying to establish independence." "I was being an ungrateful jerk," Tyler cut her off again. "Real independence means taking care of yourself while maintaining healthy relationships with people who care about him. It doesn't mean burning bridges with those who love him." In the months following our initial confrontation, Tyler had undergone an intensive education in adult reality. He discovered that working 40 hours a week at physically exhausting jobs was incomparably more difficult than attending high school classes. He had learned that $500 a month for housing was incredibly generous compared to the alternatives on the market. And he had developed a deep appreciation for things he had once taken for granted: unlimited hot water, fast internet, a full refrigerator. I want to keep paying rent, Tyler said suddenly. Why? You've proven his point. You've shown that he can be responsible. Because I don't want to go back to being that person, he/her replied simply. Paying rent reminds me every day that nothing is guaranteed, that I have to earn my place in the world. This was perhaps the most powerful lesson Tyler had absorbed. Appreciation comes from understanding that everything can be lost. A few days later, I found Tyler in the living room watching television with Gus, the dog I had adopted as a companion during the tense months. Tyler was on the floor, scratching behind the animal's ears while studying for his GED online. Hey Carlos, he said without looking up from his books, I've been thinking. What? When I get my diploma and maybe start community college, I want to study business administration. Why business? Tyler finally looked up at me, his eyes carrying a maturity that hadn't been there a year earlier. Because I want to learn how to build something of my own. Something that can provide jobs for other people. Something that contributes rather than just consumes. This transformation from parasitic consumer to aspiring value creator represented a character evolution I never would have thought possible. That night, while Tyler worked his night shift at McDonald's, I reflected on the past few months. My strategy had worked perfectly, but not in the way I had hoped. I had planned to teach Tyler about consequences and responsibility. What I didn't anticipate was how the process would transform me as well. Watching Tyler struggle, grow, and finally thrive under conditions of real responsibility taught me something fundamental about parenting and leadership. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is to refuse to continue enabling his immaturity. Kindness doesn't mean eliminating consequences. It means creating structures where people can learn and grow through direct experience. Today, Tyler is a hard-working 20-year-old who is saving money, building healthy relationships, and developing genuine goals for his future. He treats our home with respect, contributes to household chores willingly, and shows real gratitude for opportunities rather than assuming he deserves them. Most importantly, he has developed self-esteem based on real accomplishments, not imaginary entitlements. The last time we discussed the difficult period in our relationship, Tyler said something I will never forget. You could have thrown him away when he was being horrible. Instead, he taught me how to be someone worth keeping around. If this story of growth through natural consequences has inspired you, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories about how healthy boundaries transform relationships. Because sometimes the most loving thing we can do is stop protecting someone from the consequences of her own choices. Tyler learned that real independence comes with real responsibilities. And I learned that setting boundaries isn't cruelty, it's education disguised as love.